Hello, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my, every other daily live stream, almost daily live stream, COVID-19 trends. I will cover the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California in 3 sections in that order. So let's start with the countries. And by the way, you can say something in chat if you want to. If you have questions, if there's a particular country, state, or city you'd like, or county you'd like me to zoom in on, worst in total cases, and it will be, I hope, forever. It would be extraordinary if anyone ever catches the United States in that particular number, if any country does. Maybe India, but that's the only one I can imagine, and it seems to me that we've so far seen other countries learning from the mistakes and generally just ramping up their infrastructure and testing and so on in a way that hopefully means that we'll never have another New York in this epidemic, or hopefully any epidemic. Right, looking at the cases by day, the United States is at least declining. We are declining slightly, gradually, from around a little under 30,000 to now about 25,000 a day. It's a pretty small decline compared to other countries, though. If you look at the per capita, where the other countries' shapes become much clearer. Spain has this remarkable decline, and really so does Belgium, actually, where it briefly peaked, and then just slammed down to 0. And now we have the latest data points from Spain are in the range of per million, 20 per million, 24 per million, whereas at their peak they were doing 5-6 times that. So Spain has gotten much better. The United States, though, is showing this very slow decline. But at least they're not Singapore. Singapore, I think, has actually dropped a little bit in our rankings of top 25, but still their latest data point is pretty high. So they've maybe been passed by other countries, but they are certainly not showing an obvious peak and decline at this point. If we zoom out, that's a pretty noisy bunch of days, and these are individual. No, these aren't individual days. These are each 7 days. Each of these are the average new cases over the past 7 days. So even there, it's a very wild ride they've been on. We could say that they have peaked around here and that they're declining in the past week. In fact, I probably would say that, but the trend line is guessing otherwise. It's saying, well, no, that's all noise, and this is all noise, and we're just seeing a general upswing. And certainly since the early days of April, we have death cases that are above what we had a week ago. But anyway, Singapore doesn't have that many cases, is not a big contributor to the world's total cases, and therefore tends to be fairly noisy in the way the data swings around. Peru, however, is right in the middle of our list and is certainly the worst news in this graph. Well, we'll see what the rope chart says. It may have worse news. But in this graph, according to this graph, Peru is showing this sharp, steady, few exceptions, but generally pretty steady upward trajectory with no sign that it's peaked to my eye. The rope chart can sometimes detect peaks before I can see them on this graph, and so we'll look there next. But right now, Peru is on track to be the worst in the world in per capita cases. It's already at the peak, pretty much, that Spain ever reached. It's exceeded Belgium's peak. Where is Italy in all this? Italy, which was had so much trouble. Italy peaked so long ago that it's really hard to say, but I'm guessing its peak was never as high at 100 per day. It's never up at this 120 cases per million people per day that we're seeing right now in Peru. So the Central South America trend continues. That is the new epicenter. And we're not seeing it as much in some of these, but Chile, where is Brazil? Brazil, well, Brazil is looking bad, but it doesn't, in terms of its direction, it's trending upwards. We'll see how its growth is looking in the rope chart, but the direction is good. I mean bad, going upwards. It's not one of these hills. It will eventually be, but we don't know quite where that's going to happen. Judging from this, there's no particular reason to say that Brazil has peaked. No reason at all. In fact, quite the opposite. It would seem to be accelerating even as other countries are recovering. So with Brazil there, Peru though is almost off the charts in terms of the number of people per capita that are getting it every day. So in some sense, Peru has it a lot worse than Brazil. But those still are some of our worst looking countries. Russia also looking very bad. That's, I think, really starting to show itself as a new epicenter. But a lot of countries, Ireland, Belgium, pretty much all of Europe, Netherlands, Portugal, they've all just reached their peak a long time ago. Turkey, right next to Europe, sort of. I was trying to dig into a little bit about to what degree is Turkey part of Europe. It's arguable, but from the perspective of coronavirus, Turkey is part of Europe. It peaked at the same time, it's declined in the same way. So Turkey's looking good. Let's move on to the rope chart. So this shows the growth of daily new cases, not just the total number of cases, and this compensates for population because it's just showing the relative change of new cases day by day. Here again, we're using a 7-day moving average, which if you missed the day before yesterday's episode, I switched to 7 days from 3 days, which makes these trends much more stable. It also means we don't get to know things as quickly. If something suddenly changes, it's going to take longer for it to show up here, but the long-term trends are more stable. Singapore here, though, it's down at the bottom, and I think it had moved to the top. This is the one, if I haven't already forgotten, where I was saying you can look at it and see it either way. You can say, well, Singapore is peaked and dropped, or you can say it's heading upwards and this whole cluster was an anomaly. The rope chart believes that it's peaked and dropped, and so do I, actually. Singapore showing a very good trajectory, but it's also the smallest in the world and the top 25 anyway in terms of number of cases. But it looked for a minute like it was going to be the new epicenter or a new epicenter, and I really don't think that's going to happen now. We have data from here that suggests that the cases have dropped since that really bad time in mid-April, and so we'll keep watching that. But Singapore looks like the growth rate is dropping. It's now seeing 6% fewer cases each day on average. So that's good. The worst news here is Chile. Chile, again, is part of that cluster in Central South America. Brazil, Chile, Ecuador. We'll look at Ecuador, flash Ecuador briefly. Ecuador actually is looking a little better now. It's still slightly trending upwards, but though it's seeing 3% new cases every day, that 3% is not growing, and that's not a huge number. So Ecuador shows some signs of peaking. There have been some pretty disturbing images out of Ecuador, so their healthcare system has not really been able to keep up with this, and that might mean that their healthcare system can't even report. There are cases about Ecuador where they're losing track of the bodies. That may just be one case, but at least sometimes it happens in Ecuador. And if they're not even able to keep track of the bodies in their hospitals, it may well be that they're getting behind on reporting the bodies or reporting the cases. And so this maybe needs to be, we need to watch for a while until their healthcare system is no longer overwhelmed before we really believe that this is truly a trend for the better. But at least on paper, according to the total cases, the trend is flattening out. Not so Chile. Brazil is looking a little like Ecuador. Brazil it's actually a lot like Ecuador, but just a little bit higher. 7% growth in new daily cases. Brazil is definitely troubling, and there was something in the news again about how the highest of the government just aren't giving it much credibility as a threat. They're saying, well, we seem like we've reached the peak. And I would say they've reached the peak when this line crosses 0, not when it flattens out. It's when it crosses 0 that it turns the corner. So I think if they really think they've peaked, they're premature in their estimation. They're still seeing 7% more new cases every day, and that number, though it's not growing, isn't shrinking either. So they're still growing steadily, and it really doesn't look like a peak to me. But we'll see. The cluster at the bottom, as always, is Europe, Ireland, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, France, Singapore, Turkey, an honorary member of Europe, Germany, Portugal. This whole cluster is Europe. And so this is what happens when a country or a region gets pretty much over this, where they're starting to see 90%, 70% fewer cases every day than they used to. No one else is in that category, but pretty much all of Europe is. Sweden is definitely worth zooming in on here. Note Sweden is not recovering as fast as the rest of Europe, but they are recovering. Sweden, which took a much more lax approach to the lockdown, is probably paying a price. I'm definitely going off data here into a little bit of speculation, but there's an argument to be made that Sweden has paid the price for not locking down by having a slower recovery. But on the bright side, they are recovering. They are seeing 2% fewer cases every day, and this is a pretty sustained trend now, being based on 7 days of recent data. An average of 7 days, that 2%. United States and Canada also looking slightly good, barely, but just a little below zero right now as the 7-day moving average. United Kingdom not quite so good. Saudi Arabia is growing still, but has a really nice trend downward. Others with the same are Mexico and Russia. Interesting, Russia. So let's look at Russia. And let's look at India too. We're just going to separate those two out for a minute, just because those are two that, outside of Central South America, have shown every sign, several signs, let's say, of being the next epidemic epicenter. Russia, now why does this... Okay, well, I'm actually going to separate out India so we can get a better look at what Russia's really looking like. So the trend line says we're going downwards, and that's roughly based on all these points up here, and then there's a lot of points that were looking better. Now there is a sustained pattern, though, of upward movement, and so if I were drawing this trend line, I wouldn't make it so straight. I would say, well, this heads down here, but then it loses its momentum. Really, Russia is not looking so great right now, even though this trend line, the rope chart, says, well, broadly, very broadly speaking, we're seeing a downward trend. I would say we have a pretty solid argument for saying, remember, every one of these points is already an average of 7 days, and so they're pretty resistant to any kind of noise, and yet all of them are above 5% for almost an entire week. So Russia, the rope chart line goes down, but I don't believe it. I think that really there's a down and now there's an up again, as Russia is trending into bad territory with a 7% growth each day, and I think accelerating. So these trend lines are, I forget exactly the algorithm they used. It's a nonlinear algorithm, so it does try to fit something that at least doesn't always have to be a line, but it's not a moving average either. So it's somewhere between the moving average and a straight line. The moving average of these points and the trend line here is this nonlinear fit. So you can make an argument that Russia is trending downward, but and that's true for the long term. But I think there's a reason to believe that Russia is heading into dangerous territory right now. We will keep an eye on it. And then India, I also wanted to look at, because a lot of potential for India to blow up. India also is not looking so great. For a while their numbers were high and the numbers were kind of low, and the rope chart was starting to say, well, looks like we could be crossing zero. Now we're seeing them swing back upwards. Now, as always, I need to emphasize this could just be because of higher testing. We don't know. This is not an indication of underlying infection rates or the number of people who are actually getting the case. This is just the number that were reported. So if it's based on India's testing growth, let's just pop down to India's testing just so we can sort of talk about it intelligently. India's testing Where is India's testing? Do not have it. No, India's testing. India's testing is accelerating. Whenever the dots are above the trend line, that indicates that it's accelerating. It's accelerating pretty dramatically as they're testing more and more people. But it's actually terrible. With only 10%, and that's why we couldn't see it when I was flashing it, only 0.1% of the population has been tested. Now, India's population is huge, so 0.1% is still a lot, but this is not, well, it's kind of a mix. India is trying to ramp up its testing, obviously, but it's still doing quite terribly in testing. Well, these are deaths. I wanted to look at cases. So India's cases are growing a little bit. Certainly some of that is because we are accelerating testing. But it's hard to say, but I'd say overall the numbers aren't looking good for India here. First of all, their testing is abysmal. It's got to be at least 0.4% to even be respectable. And though they have a huge population, they also have the ability, presumably as a huge country, to test their population. They're not that poor a country. So we'll keep watching India, but the rope chart's initial answer is we're seeing a 7% growth every day, and it's slightly trending upwards. I would say, looking at this in a somewhat shorter term version, there really is an argument to be made, as with Russia, that we're seeing a notable upswing in the past couple weeks in India's growth rate, not just in new cases, but in the growth rate of new cases, which is a much more serious problem than that indicates an acceleration of growth rate and is tending towards epidemic growth or exponential growth. So India and Russia are definitely problem spots. We also see Chile, as we've talked about. Mexico, Peru is looking pretty good overall. And by the way, the rope chart will eventually turn if India and Russia continue in that. If they have that short-term trend, the rope chart will make a turn eventually and start pointing upwards. But it's pretty conservative. It doesn't do that until the evidence is really overwhelming. Singapore. Iran's not looking so good on the rope chart, trending upwards. Yeah, but in Europe, of course, always looking good. We've already talked about the United States. Maybe worth noting, I don't usually spend much time looking at death rates. Well, the broad trend of this appears to be slightly downward. Certainly as of early April, everyone was above zero. All the countries were above zero on this chart, and now it's about 50-50. So the 1 month trend seems to be downward. But on the other hand, if you look at the rope chart for the world, it doesn't, the world seems to show a very slight upward growth, and it's not really ever dropping below zero. Certain data points are dropping below zero, and again, this has switched around a little bit from what we've seen in past days because we're doing a 7-day moving average. There was this tendency for the world to have a weekly cycle where it'd be good on weekends. I think it got good on weekends and bad on weekdays, and then it would switch back and forth, and so that was making the 3-day moving average and its rope chart sometimes report good news and sometimes report bad news. Now that we've switched to 7-day, the rope chart is just pretty neutral on this. Very slight growth, no tendency really for the world to report to trend towards recovery. When we look at the total new cases each day, it really looks like a slight upward trend. So then that matches what we see on the rope chart, a very slight upward trend. So the world is looking like it's slightly trending towards falling back into new growth. Not good, not what we want to see, but that is what the data show us now. Deaths, interestingly, are looking somewhat. No, actually, I don't think so. They're looking about the same. Early April, every country was growing in deaths. Now about half of them are growing and half are shrinking. This is why I tend to not look at the deaths. Maybe we can say the deaths are slightly dropping. The rope chart says the death rate is slightly better, slightly below zero, but still slight. So deaths and cases aren't much different in what they're indicating. In the top 25, Portugal is winning the testing. Though there's something weird here. Do we not have new data for Portugal? I think we saw this yesterday. They just haven't been reporting data lately. Okay, we don't really know what Portugal's doing now, but evidence suggests they're probably winning in testing. Italy is winning in testing. Who's this? Belgium has taken probably second place around now, overtaking Italy in total percent of the population tested. And everyone above here, above Peru, is testing more than 1% of the population. So a lot of countries are doing pretty well. As we saw, India is doing terribly, with only 1/10 of its population tested, but at least it's accelerating. Yeah, and we don't need to look again at how great Iceland is. With 15-16% tested, they're continuing to do great. So let's move on to the states of the United States. I'm just going to reload this page proactively because it tends to break after I talk a while on a different tab, and then I have to reload it. Okay, so New York is showing a pretty good trend here. When you see dots notably below the trend line, that indicates that it's slowing down in new cases. Total cases still more than anyone. I'm guessing that no one will ever pass New York. Probably no one else will ever pass New Jersey either in total cases. But when we look at how the states are doing overall, New York is, in terms of daily cases, people certainly have passed New York. We have Illinois again looking a little bit troublesome, having passed New York in total daily cases. This is not adjusted by population, and so let's adjust it by population just to get a sense. But Illinois is looking pretty bad. Actually, yeah. So it's not that different. I guess the population of New York and Illinois aren't dramatically different, maybe, but it's, if we look at by population, New York keeps falling. It's well out of the top here in new cases adjusted for population, new cases per capita, new cases per million. Rhode Island still the winner in per capita, but trending flat now and slowly downward. Massachusetts seems to have flattened out, but it's second place. New Jersey definitely is flattened out and is falling quickly, which is why those two were able to pass it. About to be passed by Illinois. Everyone I've talked about so far is trending downward, but Illinois, you can see, is still growing, as is Iowa and Maryland. These ones are not looking as good as everyone else in this top. Those are the new upcoming epicenters, I guess. Illinois, Iowa, Maryland. Maryland maybe is flattening out a little bit. Also Minnesota and Virginia. Most of the other ones are looking small. Per million, I haven't really talked about this, but per million, California has very few cases. We focus in on California as though it's significant, but in the number of actual cases, it's way down there in daily cases per million. All these other states are doing much worse than California. And where is Colorado? Yeah, Colorado is a little more significant and maybe flat or slightly upwards. It gets hard to see down in there, so let's look at the rope chart. The growth of new daily cases. Who is this? Okay, Minnesota just popped on the graph here. In maybe the top 10 or so, and rising, I'd say faster than anyone else right now. Minnesota is rising faster than anyone else, so that's something. But it still has relatively few cases. It's 24th out of 25 in new daily cases. It's only when you put it per capita that starts to get up there. So interesting. We'll keep an eye on Minnesota, but numbers down there can always be thrown off by some mini hotspot, some particular city or even building that has a huge number of cases can bring a smaller state to the top. Colorado. Interesting. Colorado's data has been hard to make sense of because they've had such a wild ride in their reporting. We'll look at that again here. Colorado reported many days recently 0 cases or almost no cases. That's very unlikely to be true. They probably really did have cases those days but just didn't report them. and then they have this one day that combines probably all the data they didn't report from those 5 days into one day. So how is one to make sense of Colorado? Well, I would say that this trend line is not unreasonable as a guess. The trend line does to some degree compensate for a bunch of low numbers and then one high one. And if you had to draw a single straight line that ran through all these points, it might well be this. And so if that is actually the trend line for Colorado, then the new cases are growing. It's not sharply upwards, but it doesn't show signs of peaking. It has, in fact, one day with more cases than any recent day. So Colorado isn't, now we do seem to have better data now. It isn't looking better. As always, we have to say as the caveat, maybe it's because they're testing more. If so, we would eventually expect testing to catch up. We expect contact tracing to kick in and the number of infections to drop, and then they can test all they want and it still won't show any new infections. Once you reach that peak of having tested everyone who has it. So, but that could be weeks away. For now, we just know that the number is rising. Not great news on the underlying data, but maybe it's actually indicating something good in terms of the amount of testing being done. But Colorado certainly doesn't show us a trend like New York, where having peaked, they're now dropping, and they have these days where, oh, we have 16% fewer cases, and that's a rolling average of 7 days. So that's a extremely good number, that on average, for 7 days in a row, they've seen a 16% reduction of cases. That's tremendous. That's New York. Colorado, on the other hand, on average, and this is subject to this really challenging data gap, so it's not to be trusted quite. Well, let's just take these two together. They had one day where the average said 16 days in a row, or 7 days in a row, they had a 16% reduction each day, which is right in line with New York. But then here's a day that says for 7 days in a row, they had a 23 increase. And that's just because of those crazy data points, the zeros and the extreme one. We'll see this iron itself out over the next few days, provided that Colorado keeps reporting and keeps showing, and these start to roll off the recent days. And this one also, which really very much skews the sense of how much of a drop we might have had or how much of a gain we might have had. But taking the last 7 days, which do not including the very latest data point, about 11 days ago, Colorado opened up. Prematurely, some would say. Just on time or late, some would say. 11 days they opened up. Incubation is on average 11 days. 11 days later, we're seeing more cases than we saw before. So one interpretation of this, much too early for us to possibly say it is the true interpretation. In fact, we'll probably never really know, but just here's one day. One interpretation is that we're seeing a single day spike, the first of what might be many single day spikes. This is where it's a testable hypothesis, due to the Colorado opening up. Correlation does not imply causation. This could be random, this could be due to testing, but we are just getting in. My main point is we're just getting into the point where if opening up caused a spike of cases in Colorado, we would start to see it. And at least one day is giving us one single day of data in support of the hypothesis that opening up is going to cause a spike. That is far too soon to say anything about. That's why. We may, again, never know why, but something to note. If we see it for 3 days in a row, we'll really start to wonder, but even then we won't know if it's because of testing. But we can, on the other hand, compare testing. Let's just look quickly at Colorado's testing rates. Daily testing in Colorado is certainly increasing, very definitely increasing. They have low days and high days, but the trend seems to be upwards in Colorado. So we would expect, assuming that they haven't found everyone with the disease yet, we would expect that there would be an uptick in new cases reported simply because of this. This is one of the reasons why we see upticks in new cases, is because we're testing more. The other reason might be because we open up and new people get the disease, or even new people get the disease in spite of opening up. There are multiple factors. All right, let's look at California, though as we've said, it's not a huge contributor per capita. Nevertheless, it's growing. New daily cases in California do appear to be growing, but there's an argument that California has maybe flattened out more than this trend line indicates. So let's look at the trend line for California. All right, California just keeps living at zero, very, very slightly above zero. So news isn't great for California. It's not terrible. The averages are above or below zero, and California is not recovering, but it hasn't gotten worse yet. We'll keep watching it. It seems like every day this is sort of the news for California. Louisiana, which was doing so well, has definitely turned back around the corner and is now seeing a growth rate of only 1%, but trending upward pretty strongly. Colorado, we already saw, is probably our worst data point on this graph. You could definitely say that Minnesota is as well, but it's so small that it's hard to do much with, hard to believe. Colorado, though, worst data point on the graph, but the data is so noisy and it has such weird numbers in the past a couple weeks ago that also not quite to be believed yet. Virginia and Arizona aren't looking great, 5% daily growth and rising. And then there's a whole cluster, a lot of states that, let's just pick this one out. Missouri also showing an upward trend and getting worse. Texas showing an upward trend at 2 or 3% and getting worse, accelerating. So there are a lot of states that show this angle upwards. Let's just take a look at Texas's testing, daily testing. Is it accelerating? And by the way, let's compare Colorado and Texas with other states in terms of the total number they've tested. Colorado is in the dumper in terms of total tested. It's tested, well, everyone's testing so well that really it is in the worst. It is in the bottom 20% or something. But really, 1.7% tested is not bad. It's just that no one's doing poorly. The worst is Arizona with 1.3% tested, but all the states are doing all right. Texas also at the bottom of the heap, 1.6% tested, but I'd say that's all right. Anything above 1% is at least reasonable. And Texas looks much like Colorado in the way it seems to be quickly ramping up its testing. Compared to others, tested each day. But what we are seeing generally in the total tested each day is that all the states are ramping up their testing. There are a few outliers, but generally everyone is testing faster and faster. And as long as that continues to happen, as long as there are cases, undiscovered cases to be found, then we will also see something like this. We'll see a lot of upward trending, or at least above zero flat states. So there's an interpretation of this that says this is because of testing. Because we're seeing not just more and more people tested, but an acceleration of testing in virtually every state, we can expect, until we really get a grip on the epidemic, that we'll see this new wave of new cases. I'd like to think that's the case. So that's a testable hypothesis. If there are no new actual cases happening, or at least no acceleration of actual cases, no growth of actual new cases, but the testing is accelerating, and that's the reason we see a growth in reported cases. If that's the case, if we're entirely due to testing, we will, in a matter of weeks, see this turn around as all the new cases get discovered, quarantined, contact traced, and all the states will head back below zero again. If there are, on the contrary, if there is an epidemic of growth of new cases, actual new infections in the population, and if that's the major contributor to the reported cases, and if testing is not the major contributor, or is not sufficient to outweigh that, then we will see this continue upwards. So anyone's guess right now. The reported numbers don't look good, but the testing numbers do look good, and hopefully we'll be pulling these down shortly. We'll just keep watching until that happens. And eventually testing is bound to pull down these numbers, but when will it happen? These trend lines don't give us any hint of that. These trend lines, with a few exceptions, well, 10 exceptions, suggest that we are trending downward, or we are trending upward in reported cases, and will be for the foreseeable future, that in fact it's accelerating. So once those lines start trending downward, then we can again say things are going in a direction where testing and everything else has put a lid on this thing. But right now, there are a lot of states where that's just not happening. The states where that is happening is Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Georgia. That's worth noting because Georgia has opened up before some thought it was safe, but Georgia seems to be doing fine. It's got quite a, well, 4% isn't huge, but it's got a daily reduction of new cases and dropping. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Ohio, all of these daily reduction and dropping. Worth noting that Indiana, which looked good, is suddenly seeing it's rejoined this pack of states that are trending upwards. So the news is, I would say, from the data alone, the news is bad for the states. We see more states with growth than not, and we don't know why. But we have these two competing factors. But on the underlying data, on the total reported cases, the news is bad. The cases are growing. However, the testing news is good. Testing is accelerating. And so if that's sufficient to put a lid on it, then we'll see those cases drop. Let's go to the counties of California. Again, I'm just going to reload this because it's probably already broken and it's going to lose me my trend lines or put a sad face in the upper left corner of my graph, as it sometimes does. Counties of California, Los Angeles, a little disturbing that we see the dots above the trend line now, because dots above the trend line imply an acceleration of cases. We can see in this case there are some pretty bad recent days in total cases for Los Angeles. There's Los Angeles and there's everyone else. No one is anywhere near Los Angeles in even new daily cases. So there's in a sense, we could throw out the rest of the state and say the only thing that really matters is what happens to Los Angeles, because all these are just minuscule compared. But we do have San Diego trying to be a major player. If we look at it per capita, the situation is much different. So from the perspective of saying how is each region doing, this graph gives us a much different answer than the other one. It doesn't tell us where the state's going as a whole. That's just all Los Angeles. But Los Angeles per capita is actually not doing as bad as some of them. The three that are very clearly doing poorly are Imperial, which is fairly small but keeps moving up here. They were 25th when they first came in. Now they're 18th or something. Tulare and Kings. Kings just popped on the graph, so it's one of these cases where a sudden burst of cases in a relatively previously low case county has pushed them into contention. But in terms of total cases, they're still 22nd or something out of 23rd out of 25th. Not a major contributor. Again, no one but Los Angeles is really a major contributor. If you were looking great, Riverside has this nice arc, this hill that we like to see that we're not actually seeing in most counties. Look at all these counties that are just heading upwards. All of these counties headed upwards, not clearly peaking and dropping off, not looking so good. And again, is it testing? Is it the underlying infection rate? We'll just keep watching. We don't know. Santa Barbara looking good. Let's just see who else is looking good when we zoom in on the very small contributors. Wow, it's so much spaghetti. But look at how many times we're now seeing something that peaked and then shot upwards. Peaked and now is like Contra Costa. San Diego, which really seemed like it was doing well for a minute there, is now shot upwards. I'm going to look at that separately in a minute. Sonoma seemed like it was heading down. It's now going upwards. San Luis Obispo was heading down, now going upwards. So we're seeing a real corner of sorts right around the April 12th to 19th area where everyone suddenly got worse. Maybe it's because of testing. Maybe it's because there's a new epidemic. Let's look at San Diego again. Yeah, San Diego just isn't looking good. And this is just in per capita, but even if we were doing without per capita, the general trend for San Diego, well, I mean, you could say here's the peak. Recently, we've had a few low days. Maybe the rope chart is actually going to say that it thinks San Diego's headed slightly downward. I wouldn't be surprised. The rope chart often does that in terms of growth of daily new cases, but I don't think you can cheer for San Diego at this point. Let's look at that rope chart. As usual, not looking so good, and I'd say looking worse than ever. Clearly, more counties a few days after we had about a 50-50 split, maybe a week ago or 5 days ago. Definitely more counties growing than shrinking right now in new cases. As always, testing, actual new infections, we'll find out. We'll find out as the testing rate grows. We'll be able to guess at that. And if it's testing that's doing this, then eventually these lines will turn downward again. But we have Sonoma and Tulare both showing a very sharp, pretty sharp upward acceleration of a growth that's already quite high. 10% new cases, 12% new cases every day. And these aren't any of the top counties. Again, nothing but Los Angeles nothing's anywhere near Los Angeles, but those two, if they keep going that way, they'll eventually compete with Los Angeles, at least in per capita. Kings, and in fact, I think they may already be competing with Los Angeles in per capita. Kings looks a little better. San Francisco was looking good, but suddenly, not so suddenly, it's looking bad again. 7% growth every day and accelerating. Contributor, but now here it is almost in the top 10 or in the top 10. 5% growth and accelerating. Ventura, 5% growth and accelerating. A lot of bad news on the county level. Sacramento is still shrinking day over day. San Joaquin is doing pretty well, 9% and shrinking, and 9% shrinking every day, and accelerating. Small enough that it's hard to say much about, but if we had to guess, 3% shrinkage every day. And there's Los Angeles. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. And it generally the rope chart is just saying, as far as I can tell, this is following zero. Reminds me of the United States as a whole, just barely living there on that flat line of not running away with exponential growth, but not recovering either. That's the guess for Los Angeles. If you look at it here alone, yeah, so this, when you look at this, you might say, well, it's rising. And as I was saying, the rope chart sometimes says, here's a cluster of big, here's a cluster of small. I think we're roughly flat. Roughly, the rope chart is saying this line really should be horizontal. It's not too far off horizontal here. Those two charts often disagree, but the rope chart says, I think, says the rope chart, that Los Angeles is stable and not getting worse. It has zero growth and it's not getting better or worse. But this is so up and down that it's really hard to guess. Testing by county. All the counties that are reporting are doing okay. San Francisco is doing very well at 3%. Riverside doing very well. Marin doing pretty well at 2.4. Los Angeles not doing quite as well. Do I remember? Yeah, well, at least it's accelerating in the very short term, 2% and rising. So that's the news. We're in this place at globally, and I think at the state and county level, where the news straight from the data is not good. It would, if we believed these numbers to simply be reflecting the underlying infection rate, we would be worried, quite worried, because of all the counties and all the states. We'll switch to this one. No, this is testing. All the counties, all the states. No, I want the rope chart. Yeah, all the states that are headed upwards, not quite as bad in states as in counties. and all the countries that are also headed upwards, if you were to take this as a sign of the underlying infection rate, the news worldwide is neutral. The news on the state level is slightly bad. The news on the county level is a little more bad, a little worse, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And yet we have this hope because we do see testing ramping up and accelerating everywhere. We have this hope that the reason we're seeing this is not because it's the underlying infection rate, but because we are testing more and more. That will be shown out, will be borne out. I guess there's the opposite contributing pole, which is maybe we're seeing more cases because we're releasing lockdowns, or because we aren't releasing lockdowns, but people are just getting tired. We're suffering from a willpower fatigue. So at least those three factors are pulling these graphs in opposite directions. We'll just keep watching and keep pointing to those three factors and hoping that eventually we will see these turns, and hoping that soon we'll start to see these things turn downward. Eventually they have to turn downward if the whole population gets the virus, but let's hope that that's not the case, and we start to see all these graphs head downward in the next few weeks. Certainly it's not showing that trend right now, however. That is the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.